Hi, in this video we're going to look at some tips of how you can get your mix downs to sound louder. And by that I mean how you can control the dynamics and make your mixes denser and the overall density and perceived level louder. So I've got some drums as an example here. So I've got a kick snare and ghost snare. And then I've got some layers that go on top of it. And then together they sound like this with the compression. And then without the compression. It sounds a lot denser, a lot more exciting, it's got a lot more energy to it. But the transients, if anything, are more pronounced than they were before. So what I've done is routed the kick snare and ghost snare going to the second bus here, which is, think of this as the drum bus, so everything goes here. But what I've done is all the top layers, the closed hat rides, etc, etc, all these channels are in the second folder, are all going to this first bus, and then this first bus here is then going to the second bus. So I can control everything above the kick and snare in this one bus here. And what I've done is I've used an EQ just to cut out some of the very low frequencies, and then used a compressor to sidechain everything that's above the kick and snare and ghost snare from the kick drum and snare drum. So I've got routed here on the kick and snare channels on ascend. They are triggering this compressor. So sidechaining basically is where you use a compressor but you use an external source of audio to trigger the compressor. So every time a kick and snare event happens, you'll see in the gain reduction meter here, the level gets pulled down. So that makes the transients a lot more pronounced. I've also used a little bit of makeup gain, almost a decibel, to bring up the level of the top layers because I could make them slightly louder without them masking the kick and snare as much. And the reason I've done this is, even though a kick and snare you might think of as elements that are in the low end or the low mids of your track, the initial few milliseconds of a kick or snare have a lot of high end in them. That transient starts at a very high frequency, then drops down very, very quickly. So even if you cut the low end out of the elements above by say 200-300 Hertz, that initial transient is going to get masked by the high end in those other elements. If you just listen again very closely just to the transients of the kick drum and snare drum with and without the side chaining. If I just loop one bar. And then this bus here goes to the second bus, where it's being combined with the kick and snare and ghost snare. And firstly I've got a little bit of saturation, just using Camelphat, a little tiny bit of mech, and this adds a little bit of brightness and it controls the peaks a little tiny bit as well, but it's not doing much to them. And then next I've done some parallel compression. So what parallel compression is where you over compress a signal and then mix it back in with the dry signal. So in this case I've gone really over the top. I've used no attack, no release, ratio of 4:1, and the threshold is down as far as it'll go, minus 40 decibels. And let's have a listen to this with the compression 100% wet. So the transients now sound very, very muffled because of how fast the attack is, but it adds a lot of density. It sounds a lot thicker. It sounds quite distorted as well. There's some saturation in there from the compression. But if I mix this back in with the dry signal, we get a combination of the original transients coming through, but that thickness and sustain in the body of the drums. So to show you this a bit better, what I've done is I've bounced down the drums. So this is done without any of the processing on those two buses, and then this is with. And if we look here, you can see the transients, there isn't much difference. If you look at these three here, you can see they've been brought into line a little bit, but there's only maybe a fraction of a decibel that's been taken off the peaks. Whereas if we look at the second, you can see that the elements that are lower have been brought up a lot. They're a lot louder in comparison. So what we've done is, rather than, if we used a limiter and straightforward compression, what we'd be doing is bringing down the peaks and then bringing up the volume, because we'd have the extra headroom, which would then give us a more loud and dense mix. But with using the sidechaining and parallel compression, we've done it the other way around. We've taken the quietest elements of the drums and pushed the level of those up, whilst keeping the transients pretty much the same. And this has given us a lot more perceived level, a lot more loudness. And brought up a lot more of the detail in the drums. And now at this stage we could apply your normal drum compression, because we've got these peaks still here. We can still apply compression and more saturation and make it sound even louder and really glue the drums together. But by doing these few stages first, it's going to give us a lot more density and thickness to the drums. Now for another example, I'm going to look at soft clipping and limiting. So I've got a simple bass loop off the Virus. It's nothing amazing, but it has some dynamics in, which is great to show as an example. So I've used K-clip on here, and it's clipping by 3.7 decibels. So what soft clipping is it sort of models what happens in analog when you clip a signal. So as the signal goes above 0 in here, it rounds off the waveform. It gets clipped, but it does it in a more pleasing way than what happens in digital, where it just gets squared off. Instead of it just getting completely squared off when you clip in digital, what happens in analog is the waveform gets bent around the point where it clips. It gets smoothed off. And generally the idea is this is used for mastering before a limiter, so the limiter doesn't have to work as hard. But it's a great way to deal with peaks in a track as well. So let's have a listen to before and after. As it's a form of saturation, a form of distortion, it's added some harmonics in the high end, but it's quite subtle, I would say, considering the fact that it's actually clipping 3.7 decibels, which is quite a lot of clipping. And this is the clipped version I've got bounced down here. So you can see what it's done. It's shaved off all the peaks out of the audio. It's a lot more dense and compact. And I mean, in this example, you probably won't want to go that far, but if you have peaks in your audio, soft clipping can be a good way to control them. Because if you use a compressor, it always has an attack time. There is always an envelope. No matter how fast you set this attack, it's the fastest of transients, the fastest of peaks are still going to get through. Whereas with a limiter, there is no attack time, and the same with a soft clipper, there is no attack times. So anything that exceeds 0 dB in here, anything that clips internally, it's going to get shaved off no matter how fast that peak is, no matter how fast that transient is. It's going to get smoothed off. And that's the same with a limiter. If it goes above the threshold, no matter how fast it is, it's going to get clipped. And this is great that if you have a vocal, say for example, and say it's a 16 bar loop, and for the majority it's fine, but there's just 2 little sections where it jumps out too loud, you can use a limiter and set the threshold so that just those points where it jumps out, it just limits it a little bit there and controls those peaks, but it'll still be quite transparent because it's not limiting the majority of the time. The problem is though, if you use limiting aggressively throughout your track on different elements, when you then layer them together in terms of a mix, there's a good chance they're going to start to distort because there isn't any dynamics there. You're going to get cumulative peak distortion. So it's something to use sparingly, but I would say limiting is a great tool in the mix for controlling peaks, and it can do a better job in certain scenarios than a compressor for sure.